How's everyone doing? Okay, we'll be starting in just a few moments. And we're sending the sign-in link in 1 minute, less than 1 minute. Woo. It's SCBS226. Welcome.
How's everyone doing?
You are required to speak.
Please talk to us. Please talk to us. It'll be nice. We want interaction. Thank you, Grace. We appreciate you.
Amazing. Yeah, it's more of an informal vibe right now just because there isn't no one in the room besides officers. Yeah, it's a little weird having two GBMs in 2 like consecutive weeks, but that is something we decided to do. But yeah, we'll just wait a couple more minutes and the speaker will be here. She's running a little late, but I can also just start in a couple minutes.
Lucky GBM for all of you. You get exclusive chaotic content from us. I guess. I mean, it's just the two of us and Kaylee vibing over there. So, you know, sheer chaos. Also drag that off that screen. Yes, there you go. Everything's great. Zoom is chaotic and I hate it.
Welcome. Let me send the link again. Nishka says you're missing out on quality pizza. Okay, but yes, the speaker today will be Dr. Lucky talking about conservation and invasive species and other things. But let me just get started because why not? Okay, so yeah, I sent the link and everyone who's here already knows about this stuff. Amazing. And okay, oh, more people here. Okay. Hello, Dr. Lucky. Okay. Yeah, I'm just going over some announcements real quick. But yes, everyone knows about the point system. I have another slide about the moat aquarium in a few slides, but also TerraCycle, I'm still in contact with the New and Ziegler Hall people, but still collect your items and be able to bring it in when we announce that it's a setup. And then we have some upcoming events. We have a Blaze fundraiser on March 26th. It's a Saturday and it's from 11 a.m. to 9 p.m. basically all day. And we're planning a meetup at 6 p.m. And it's the Blaze on Archer Road. There's a flyer in that sheet that I linked in the chat. And just tell them that you're there to support SCB. And then another thing where you can see a lot of officers is at the Sustainability and Action Tabling, which is on April 6th. And you can visit us at the Riots Union Breezeway between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. It's just a tabling event. If you want to come and talk to us or like learn more about our upcoming events that we are still in the midst of planning for April. Yeah, so for April, we're doing more an Earth Month extravaganza just because we have a lot of events planned. So on April 3rd is our Audubon birding field trip, which Kaylee will talk more about.
Hello, everyone. It works, right? All right. Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. So on Saturday, April 3rd. Oh, wait, actually, I think it's a Sunday. It's Sunday. Yeah, Sunday, April 3rd at 8 a.m. We're going to be going to Post Springs Park, where it's an official Audubon field trip. So the trip leader, his name's Tim, he's going to be guiding us through Post Springs. And we're going to be looking for specifically warblers, I think he mentioned. So that's going to be really exciting. So the sign up sheet is going to be sent in the little chat eventually. But oh, it's there. Okay, awesome. But yeah, so I don't doubt you. But also let us know if you need carpooling on the sheet. So, but yeah, that's all I have to say about that.
And then also our beach cleanup that we have, we had scheduled on March 19th. We moved it to April 9th because of weather and also having more people sign up. So yeah, it's now still Saturday, April 9th. It's at 10 a.m. At Crescent Beach, and we'll be arranging carpooling as well. It's about an hour and 30-minute drive. So yeah, and we also have money for gas reimbursements so that you don't have to pay for the whole gas tank. And then we have a couple of events that are still pending in terms of planning. We have an Itchitucknee Springs State Park volunteering thing. It involves, I think, turtle banding and bird banding and like water lettuce clean up. And yeah, that is going to be announced further on. And we also have a an organization called Current Problems. We're planning a paddling and creek cleanup event with them, and that's also on April 10th. So keep an eye out on our GroupMe and email list. And for those of you that are going to the end of your trip, all of the information was sent out today, but yeah, just basically if you receive the email, let us know if you're coming because we want to know if everyone can come, and if not, we want to be able to give that spot to someone else. But yeah, it's coming up, so be on the lookout. And without further ado, please welcome our speaker, Dr. Andrea Lucky. She's an associate professor in insect systematics and the principal investigator of the Lucky Lab. Also, more detail, an evolutionary biologist and biodiversity scientist with a focus on the evolution of ants. So, welcome.
Thank you. It's nice to be here. Hi, everybody. I don't know, can you hear, first of all, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. I don't know how many people you have actually in the classroom there. How many of you are there?
Not many. It's only
So it's mostly
right
an online crowd. I'm asking because I don't want to exclude people who are there, and sometimes it's different talking to people on Zoom versus in person. But if most people are watching on Zoom, then it makes it a little bit easier because I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and I just didn't know what your screen, what your projection looks like in the classroom. So thank you guys so much for inviting me. I am totally thrilled to be able to talk to you, and I'm sorry I was arriving just a little bit late, but it was great to hear what you guys are doing. I'm super happy to know how active you are. I really am impressed by this list of events that you guys have coming up and all these great conservation organizations that you're working with locally. I'm going to talk to you today about ants, but I guess partly what I want to send the message about is that conservation works in all kinds of interesting ways. As you know, I'm sure you partner with people who have very specific interests. And what I'm going to be talking about today is essentially a perspective on conservation that comes to you from the ant world. So this is a little bit of a put your ant goggles on kind of talk. And then I hope you have some questions at the end. I don't expect that everybody here is going to be super into ants. But I guess if you're not into ants at all, that's fine too, because you can probably take some of these general patterns that I'm going to be talking about, transpose them onto some favorite organism you have or organisms. And I think it's what I'm going to be talking about today is something that you'll find representative of global change, sort of where we are and the conservation needs that are happening right now. So before I get started, let's see, are you able to see my screen? You're seeing it? Okay. Does it say Planet of the Ants in big fancy letters? Okay. So this is one of my favorite ways to give a talk is to sort of talk about this Planet of the Ants. But I will say that when I am giving formal talks, it looks more like this, you know, very formal, tools for studying ant invasion biology. And then I talk about population genetic work, phylogenomic work, and I'll talk about some of that today. But I figured for you guys, you might want a slightly different perspective rather than just the technical version. So for anybody who does want the technical stuff, stop me, ask me questions throughout. Feel free to interrupt, or let's see, I don't know if I'll be watching the chat. I can probably pull it up. Well, somebody just flag me down and say, hey, you have a question in the chat, if that's what, if something comes up. So thank you guys. Thank you guys for inviting me already, by the way. Thanks. Okay. So is this a term familiar to you guys, the Anthropocene? So who knows their geologic eras? Anybody? All of you? Sometimes when I give talks, people don't necessarily aren't as familiar with this terminology. So I'll just briefly mention that oops, moving fast. The Anthropocene basically refers to anthros, or humans, and how we have defined this era of geologic history as by dominating the globe and changing things. So if you're involved in this organization, I expect that the concept is not new to you, even if the term is not one that you use often. In some ways, it's considered a synonym of the Homogeocene, which I like this term a lot because homo meaning humans, like we've dominated it, just like the idea of the Anthropocene, but also homo because of homogeneous or homogenized, because really what we're doing on planet Earth is taking a lot of places that are wildly diverse and turning them into places that look really similar. So if you don't recognize what state this is, you have not been in Florida for very long. This is very recognizably Florida, although there's probably some other places on the planet that might have a similar building pattern. But you know, this is something that we see all over the world. And it didn't just happen in the past 100 years. People have been doing this as we have developed our agricultural systems and developed our residential areas. There are certain ways that we like to live, and we tend to replicate it as our population grows. I'm not going to give a really depressing talk, by the way. This is just the beginning part, so don't tune out. Don't quit and think it's going to be too depressing. But what I want you to think about today is not just the Anthropocene. I won't do too many bad puns, but the world that I live in, the people who are really into ants, really will tell you that you've got it all wrong. This is just like a blink of an eye. Humans are here. But you know, for the past 50 million years, this planet has been completely dominated and changed by ants. And so we might as well think of this as the Anthropocene. And if we wanted a better term, I'll come back to that in a second, so we weren't just using English, we could just call it the Myrmecocene. Myrmeko meaning ant in Greek. This is really an era on planet Earth that has been defined by the greatest ant diversity that ever existed. So if you look around the planet right now, we have some great tools and a lot of really interesting information about ant diversity. There are about 13,000 named species of ants on Earth. For those of you guys who are looking for Florida, don't worry, we'll get to that. You don't have to squint. But this is just the named species. We think there's somewhere between 20 and 30,000 species altogether. There's still a lot of discovery to be done. And this is one of the reasons that I started working on ants and doing ant systematics, describing new species. I was really interested in biodiversity. I still am. It was the thing that motivated me to become a biologist. I wanted to know what's out there that we just don't know about. And I found insects early on when I was in college. I just thought this is the most amazing thing. There's so much out there we don't know about them. And then with ants, it's not just that we don't know about them, it's that we know enough to have a scaffold to really build on. And that has continued to be true. Okay, so here we are in the Myrmecocene, this world where ants dominate nearly every single terrestrial habitat, except where it's permanently frozen. So I'd like to invite you to spend a little bit of time just kind of getting to know your neighbors. They've been here long before we have. They are much more important for every single ecosystem that's around terrestrially. They have incredible relationships with lots of other organisms, and they may be able to give us some really good insight into what's coming next down the line, and also into the resilience of the communities that we care about and want to preserve. So I'm going to talk a little bit about leafcutter ants, just because I know it makes people happy to see these little parades of leaves going down paths in the rainforest. So One example of how ants are so influential, not just that there's so many of them, but amongst the species that are out there and their great diversity, their behaviors make them especially important in different habitats. So leafcutter ants do this thing where they go out and the workers cut leaves off of trees. It's really frustrating for people who are foresters and trying to do plantation forestry because, of course, they're growing the plants and then the leaves are getting cut away. The ants take these leaves down into their nests and they grow these beautiful fungus gardens. They don't eat the leaves, but they grow their very specific fungus on there. Now, you can see these mycelial threads sort of knitting together these fungus gardens. They're not eating the threads, they eat little mushroom bodies that grow on them. This is a very specialized relationship. They're not just grazing on grass, if you will. It's more like they're eating wheat. They're actually cultivating it. So that's just the story of the ants, but let's talk about how they affect landscapes. So this is my friend Jo with her foot up on the nest entrance to a single nest. This atta nest, the atta is the genus, these leaf cutters have a single queen. This is a single colony, and this is just the entrance. So if you want to get a sense of how big this colony is and its impact on the landscape around it, I can offer you this view of basically a BBC project where they did a filming trying to show what the inside of an atta nest, or maybe this one might have been an Acromyrmex nest, what it looked like on the inside. And they spent a month excavating it and filling all of the tunnels and chambers with concrete. So what you see down there on the bottom left is actually the true size of this structure. Now remember, each of those ants is somewhere between 2 and 5 millimeters long. And so little by little, they are building up these massive colonies over years and years and years. They're excavating a huge amount of soil. They're bringing lots of leaf material in. They are engineering that ecosystem. Unless you think that there's just one big colony that dominates the landscape, you can take a look from a satellite view and see how each one of these little, what looks like white dots in this landscape, how they're distributed all across this landscape. Each one of those is a colony entrance, a nest entrance, like you saw my friend Jo putting her foot up on that big pile of dirt, which is sort of the remnant of all the dirt that's been excavated from the bottom. So it gives you a sense of the impact this one species of ant has on this landscape, and how with all of the changes that have happened over 50 million years or so, how these species actually have shaped the landscape, the plants that grow there and the other organisms that can live there. And of course, it's not just the leaf cutters. There are all kinds of ants all over the place that do things like, well, these ants have relationships with honeydew producers. So these little aphids, they suck juices from the plants. Too bad for the plant, but kind of great for the ants because then they get these nice cheap carbohydrates that are just being pumped through the aphids. They're like little drinking straws. So this is something that has led to a really interesting dynamic where you get ants that are effectively herbivores. Now, we don't usually think of ants eating plants. We think of them as eating insects or other sorts of things, but it's all plant material just filtered through the aphids. So this creates dynamics where in ecosystems, when you sort of economically trace where does the energy flow, for a lot of ants, it goes directly from plants into the ants. Ants also do really interesting things that we sometimes don't notice because it's on a scale that we're just not paying attention to. These ants are taking a little fruiting body off of a seed that has lots of attractive chemicals in there for them. So sort of the way that we might smell, oh, I don't know, like something that smells really good, a really ripe fruit, like a papaya or a jackfruit or a melon that's just perfectly ripe, or a peach, probably a peach is the best example. Oh, it smells so delicious. You smell it, you know, you want to eat it. You might even be attracted to it from far away. This is what happens. These ants will bring these home. They'll work hard to peel off that little device on there. And then sometimes they even bring the seed in their nest to work on it. Whether they leave it in the nest or they get rid of it when they're doing some spring cleaning, they end up dumping these in their dump pile, which has lots of nutrients because it's all exoskeletons, chitinous material or garbage. And so it's a little bit of fertilizer. And then of course, they've dispersed these little understory plant seeds. This is a very common phenomenon, especially in fire-prone landscapes. And so our Florida landscapes are hugely dependent on ants in their wooded areas, especially for these little understory plants that you might only notice as just ephemerals. They pop up, they flower, they kind of disappear, they have leaves for a little while, and then they're gone. So anybody who's into spring wildflowers, chances are ants around here are responsible for dispersing some of their seeds. And then, of course, they're doing all kinds of things like being territorial, fighting with other species of ants for resources. And then there are all these other species of insects that are trying to get at what the ants have. So this beautiful series of images here is made by a colleague of mine who studies Myrmecophilus beetles. So these are all beetles who live in ant nests. And they have this really tricky job, which is to try to live inside the ant nest and not be detected as somebody who's not an ant. So they somehow make their way into the fortress. They either have really great chemicals that disguise them, or like the one that looks sort of like a horseshoe crab there, they have really good protection, physical protection, so that they can't get their legs ripped off or their head ripped off by the ants when the ants eventually do figure out, hey, you're not an ant. So many of these are feeding on the ants' babies, or taking advantage of other food resources in the nest. And certainly they're benefiting from the protection of ants, which tells us that, ants actually are doing a pretty good job. They have resources, they have protection. There are a lot of different interesting insects that want to live with them. So what does any of this have to do with conservation? Well, if we think back to a few examples that I just showed you, now explode this out to the scale of 20 or 30,000 species total around the planet, each of them having major impacts on other insects around them or potentially on Earth systems, being little ecosystem engineers. There's a lot at stake. A lot of our ecosystems are dependent on them in ways that we just might not know about. And so when we think about doing things like restoring woodlands, for example, our pine savannas in the Southeast, we often talk about restoration as being about the plant community. One of the things we might really need to be thinking about is also what's the invertebrate community in these places and how important are they? How will those little plants get distributed around if the ants aren't there to move the seeds? And this is some of the work that gets done in my lab as people do ecology, but also work on some systematic questions. But just briefly, I mentioned that I really got interested in biodiversity, and that's what got me into biology. And some of the first work that I did was in tropical rainforests. And I just thought, this is totally the life I want. I want to go out, I want to collect insects, I want to be able to spend time with a microscope and looking at these things and just seeing this wild mega diversity. And so when I started working, I just wanted to go to every tropical place in the whole wide world. I still do. But one of the things that happened was I got to go to some really incredible places. And one of the places that really made a huge impression on me was Papua New Guinea. And I got to spend some time there with Conservation International doing one of their rapid assessments. And I was part of a big team of people. There were plant people and mammal people and herp people. And they're just, sort of like a dream team of biologists and geologists and such. It was fabulous. So this is my field team that I was working with. These guys are laughing because in New Guinea, at least this part of New Guinea, it's very inappropriate for women to decorate themselves. It's only men who put flowers and things in their hair. That's very common for men to do. And so they're all laughing that I had flowers on my head. And that guy's just waving his machete because it was fun. And then I did a lot of sampling, and it was extremely remote and extremely diverse. And after spending a month in the field, we found hundreds of species, of which somewhere around 60 were new, undescribed to science. So when I say mega diversity, it was just like, wow, this is so amazing. But the question that really struck me is, I was in the process of getting my PhD. I was close to the end of doing a PhD on ants, on ant systematics, and I was studying this region of the world. So when I picked up this ant with dirty fingers, I said, okay, I'm pretty sure I know what this is because I've studied it. But this is a problem around the world because there are not so many people whose life goal is to learn all the ants and be able to spot them and name them. And in fact, if we get to 30,000, how are we going to expect individual people to know this? We really need some resources so that people can sort them out. And then when I came to Florida about 10 years ago, I realized this is an amazing place, just like so many of these other tropical places I've been to, because it has this really interesting combination of just tremendous diversity. I mean, 182 native species in Florida is a lot. Even just learning those is a particular endeavor just to get to the point where you can recognize our native species. But in addition, we also have, and those numbers are outdated now, I think it's 64, because they're steadily going up. We have a lot of exotic species as well. Not all of these are considered fully invasive, but that is a really big proportion of our community. And just to give you a sense of what that means, here's my analogy for you. And these not to size, not to scale, just for the visual. If this is the full global ant species of the world and Florida ants are this little slice, most of the world has lots of ants that are not distributed outside of their native ranges. So so they live in their native ranges. They're not considered problematic pests elsewhere. Only 1% of the world's ants are known outside of their native ranges. But in Florida, a good 25% of our total ant fauna is exotic. So it's not quite Hawaii, where there were never any social insects to begin with, but Florida has this strange thing happening where what happens? Do we just get a total ecosystem meltdown when we don't have a sufficient amount of our existing community intact? And so this place is a really interesting place to study because how do we approach this? There's some real questions here. I think this is true in a lot of our aquatic ecosystems. It's true with plants, but with ants, we have the opportunity to see whether we're just watching new species come in and take over from older species, or if there's a potential for coexistence. So there are a handful of species around here that we would consider globetrotters. They're the ones that are common and widely dispersed all around the world. We know our red imported fire ants. They practically feel like they belong here at this point. A lot of people have grown up with them and have no idea that they are not from here, but they are a new element in this ecosystem. And for a lot of these invasive ants, it's a really interesting thing because when you see them, you wouldn't necessarily know if they're invasive or if they're native. So these are some European pavement ants in the Midwest, and they're doing something that people have seen so many times. It's just so familiar that most people don't even have an inkling that they're introduced to the US because they're so common on sidewalks. But they're having a territorial battle and they're all coming out and fighting with one another. People see it all the time. It's pretty exciting and pretty interesting, but not all of our invasives are that obvious. So we've got all of these species out there. And just like when I showed you that picture of dirty fingers picking up an ant, we have a lot of people who might pick up an ant, maybe not so many people, but we have very few people who can actually identify, are these the native ones, the ones that we want to protect? Maybe they're rare and we want to make sure that they have some sort of conservation plan to make sure they get to stay in those ecosystems. Or is this a newly introduced species that we need to be especially on alert for, because then we need to take some sort of action for managing these populations, potentially trying to eradicate them before they get too big and have too much of an impact. So one of the rules of ant invasion biology, and this is true for many other invasive taxa, is that where humans go, the ants follow. I'll walk you through this graph because it's a really interesting one from a paper that came out a few years ago. This woman, Cleo Bertelsmeyer, went through the process of looking at records of ants that had been introduced to places outside their native ranges and looked at when they were first recorded outside of their native range. So this is the top 36 listed off to the right. That's just short versions of their names. And what you can see is that some number of them have a regional distribution. So they moved from their country to other ones nearby, but on the same continent. Transcontinental in orange means that they moved to a whole different continent. And then in red there, those ants have gone global. And so if you take a look at these most widespread ones, I put their Latin names out there, we've got them all here in Florida. These are our suite of tropical tramps or globetrotters. And they are likely to have been distributed starting early on in the late 1700s or early 1800s. So this is a process that's happening where ants are being distributed around the world, but they're only really expanding their populations over time. It does take time. So knowing that there's this process that happens, we have to ask some questions about what we can do about it and how we can not just be reactive to, oh no, there are new species that have arrived. We want to know, can we predict the next global invaders or prevent them from getting established, becoming problematic? And then not just predict and prevent, but back to this basic question of, can we put a name on them? Can we even identify the species that we need to be worried about? And for me, this is where this intersection between the biodiversity and then the applied science, the practical science of who's doing the identifying, what tools are out there to put a name on something? How are we going to train people to do this? This is the people side of things. And so I'm talking about this because this is basically the work that I've set out for myself in my lab. I think the big exciting traveling stuff is great, but I actually think that Florida has the potential to be kind of the next training grounds for teaching people what it's like when you have 25% of your population actually composed of invasive species. This is a place people could come and prevent invasions from happening elsewhere. So I'll talk a little bit more about that, but I don't want to go on too long because I know you guys might have some questions, but I'll just make the point really clearly here that the taxonomy is where everything starts. So when you have diversity, massive diversity, or even if you only have a little bit of diversity, we have to put a name on a species and be able to reliably associate that species with a name. So if you pick something up off the ground, you know what it is, you can connect it to literature about that organism, and you can develop plans for managing them or protecting them effectively. All conservation depends on this. I cannot say I've ever met anyone who's like, taxonomic career is the most glamorous thing I've ever wanted, except for the handful of people who I work with directly, because all of us are like, yeah, taxonomists are superheroes. But most people are like taxonomists, whatever, there's not a lot of funding in it, but it is really fundamental to biology. So I'll just very quickly breeze through a project that we're doing in my lab right now, working on crazy ants. I know there are a lot of common names out there that don't hold a lot of water, but this one is something that's applied to a bunch of different ants, but this particular genus, we have a lot of species that we've had to do some work on just to figure out what we're looking at. And if you live in Florida, you've probably heard of crazy ants for the past 10 years because they have been really problematic and economically important. So because of taxonomic instability, essentially the inability to put a name on a species that arrived in about 2000 to the United States, it was not until 2010 that a name finally was applied. And part of the reason is this funny graph up on the top left, which is the changes that have been made to names of different genera and the years that those changes were made. If you're having trouble reading this, you're not alone. It's been likened to following the different characters and where they travel throughout the Lord of the Rings. It's complicated, and it means that there have been changing definitions of these genera over time. Now that the group is getting more stabilized, thanks to a PhD student who was working in my lab, Jason Williams, we can tell this story a little bit better. There were a whole bunch of common names for this new thing that was introduced in about 2002 to Texas and also in Florida. And people just didn't know, what is this thing called? We can't get a name on it. But because it looked a lot like something that was already here that wasn't problematic, people went back and forth between saying, hey, this is a really problematic thing, to don't worry about it. It's been here forever. It's not that big a deal. But after 10 years, people gave it a name. And it turns out it wasn't that hard. You just had to be an ant taxonomist to figure it out. I'm sort of saying this tongue in cheek because now we're working on it a little bit more and it is pretty complicated. But Jason, one of the things he went and did is he looked through the literature for this genus and he wanted to know how many species actually were invasive in this group. He found 20 records, or 20 species were recorded as being problematic invasives. 13 basically did the work of combing through the literature and then verifying records to find out what's the story of these really. Do we really have 20 invasive pests, or how many of them are really problematic? So he published a paper just saying, listen, we need to verify records. Somebody has to go through and actually do some ground truthing, because in the past people had been saying that there were many, many more problematic species in this genus. But part of the problem was that people were just going based on what the ants looked like. And in this group of ants, the differences come down to some very subtle characters like hairs and how long they are, whether they're wavy or straight, and it's pretty subtle. So we went ahead and we did some fancy molecular work using ultra-conserved ultra-conserved elements. If anybody's interested in this, it's a way of basically doing a genomic reduction. So we didn't have to sample whole genomes, but we got to use probes that allowed us to get a whole bunch of genetic information and use that molecular data to really pick apart what we were looking at in these different groups. So one of the main questions Jason and I really had when we attacked this group was, okay, what about those 20 species that were considered to be invasives? Is there one particular lineage that somehow all these invasive species are tied to? Like maybe there's this one particular characteristic of one of the groups in this genus that allows them to be extra special and successful at being invasive? Well, the first thing we found out is that's absolutely not the case, because there were all these independent origins of globetrotting, of basically traveling around the world. So no, there wasn't some way to predict, yep, if they belong to this lineage, they're much more likely to be invasive than if they belong to some other lineage. And that's helpful because it tells us we need to look a little bit more at the ecology of the species rather than just the origins. But in terms of the origins, one of the things we did learn, and this is sort of a little bit of a chaotic slide, but we wanted to get down to the origins of where did these different lineages come from so that we could take those invasive species and tie them definitively to a place of origin. So for example, if there was something in Florida that had sort of invasive type behavior, but we didn't really know where it came from, we couldn't quite be sure if this is just a trampy, aggressive native species that behaves in a way we don't like, or if it was actually introduced before we had records. And this is true for a lot of the world, and many of our most widespread invasive species were spread around in the late 1700s. So we don't know where they came from. They just happen to be a little bit of everywhere. So we were able to tie all of those species to a place of origin, which allows all the places that they have become introduced to say, yes, this is definitively a non-native species. If it's from Mauritius, then even the places that thought that it had been there forever, they can understand that, yeah, this is actually something that was introduced as many as 200 years ago. But one of the big challenges we're facing is that there are a bunch of species that look really similar. And they are sister species, which means that they're going to look similar, they're going to behave similarly, they're closely related to one another. And some of them are super problematic, and some of them are not so problematic. So we had these three pairs of morphologically similar species that we wanted to figure out, are they really different species? Because if they are the same species, we're going to have a hard time going back and forth about names. If, on the other hand, maybe these widespread species are really made up of a whole bunch of different species and two names is not enough. So we used our molecular data to help us figure out where the boundaries are, what the species boundaries are, so that we can go back and then find morphological characters. So something that you can look at under a microscope and say, yes, this is the size range, or this is the number of hairs you're going to see on that part of the body, or this is the shape of the hairs, that will definitively tell you you've got this species and not that one. And that's probably one of the most important things that we need to do fundamentally for invasive species, is help define what are they? Because all of these species, these introduced ones that are very trampy, they occur in places where there are really fragile ecosystems. So think about the Caribbean, on islands, places at low, close to sea level, fragile beach ecosystems. These are exactly the places that get invaded most quickly and often get affected most, because the introduced species are often disturbance specialists. And so these ants tend to appear in places where we really do want to protect our native communities. So we're starting from the ground up with these. We're getting really good species boundaries. We're defining what the characters are to look for. And then we can work with people who do things like inspections at ports of entry and the identifiers, so that we can actually start to do this business of predicting maybe not which invasive species we need to be worried about, but when they arrive at ports of entry or when somebody spots them, we can help control them. So this is one of the things that I'm really interested in now. And even though I started out my career really wanting to get away, far, far away into remote places where there was nobody around, now I spend a lot of my time teaching people and actually working with government, regulation, even pest control. I run this class called Invasive Ant Boot Camp, and this didn't happen in 2020, unfortunately, despite my cool poster, because of COVID. But we're going to run it this year in May, which is just a short course on how do you identify invasive ants. And people who attend it are systematists, applied researchers, people who are doing any kind of work where they need to spot those ants. Also, I've had some educators come through, and people who work in pest control. I'm really interested. So this kind of stuff is not something that I ever really expected to be doing, but I find that it's some of the most appreciated work that I do, because it really does make a difference. So I didn't want to go too long. I see I've already talked for a while, but I want to say thank you to you guys for your time and for the invitation. I also want to thank my lab. I have a really awesome lab full of people who do all kinds of interesting and different things in the lab. And if anybody here has questions for me, I'd be happy to answer now, but if people are shy and don't want to ask questions in front of others, here's my contact information and you can just reach out to me.
So much. We have a question in the room.
I do have a question. When you were on your slide about being in Papua New Guinea, what exactly in that photo were you doing? That looked really interesting.
Yeah, let me go back to that photo because yeah, it was really interesting. This is one of my favorite tools. Sorry, this is jumping around a lot. There we go. You mean the middle one on the left, right? These strange bags?
That one and on the next slide of you holding like the bags, or maybe it's not the next slide.
Me holding the bags. Gosh, what?
It was like this pair.
This one here?
That one.
Okay, so this one, this is actually in Ecuador. And what, if anybody has taken a biology class and that first introduction to like biodiversity, how many species are out there and how do we know? Has everybody taken a class where they had this conversation, usually at the beginning of the semester? Anybody? Maybe people were sleeping through that part, but usually in a textbook, there's this conversation that happens about how do we know? And then we say, well, we don't really know, but we have some estimates and it's between 1 million and probably 10 million species that are out there of animals and plants. We're not talking about microbes at this point. Well, this guy who has this machine that's spewing out fog, it's actually an insecticidal fog. And his name is Terry Irwin. And he was an entomologist who wanted to understand if we could numerically predict how many insects were out there. And he started with beetles and he basically said, okay, here's my back of the envelope calculation. I'm gonna fog a bunch of trees with this pyrethrin pesticide, which means that it dissolves, it basically dissipates, it gets broken down by UV light. And so it's gone within a couple of days. But at the time when he fogs up that tree, the fog goes out, it kills a bunch of insects, and then they all fall down on these sheets that you see below, these plastic sheets or these sheets there. And then we catch everything underneath in a little funnel at the bottom. And then a whole team of entomologists sits there and goes through and we collect boxes full of specimens and sort them all out and count them. And then Terry basically looked at his beetles and said, okay, there are this many beetles on this many different trees, and there are this many different trees and this many different forests in the world. And I'm going to calculate more or less how many beetles there would be on trees and the proportion of beetles to the other insects and blah, blah, blah. Basically did this back of the envelope calculation and he said 30 million. Now he had a little bit of bluster in him and he knew that number was just gonna raise lots of the discussion. And it certainly did, because at the time people said that maybe 1 million. And here he was saying 30 million just insects. So for years, people debated this question. People have studied it in different ways, but this particular method has been used in just a handful of situations, and it's been really instrumental for understanding communities of insects that are not in trees or embedded in leaves, just free living insects. So that's a really interesting process. And at this point, people like to put the number more reasonably around 10 million. I was lucky enough to work with him when I was an undergraduate. And so my first publication, my first author publication was from when I was an undergrad and based on data that was gathered with Terry. So he was a researcher at the Smithsonian, and I was really fortunate to have his support to do this. I did want to tell you though about these bags, these hanging bags, because this is a technique that I love. This is a leaf litter collection technique. So I go out into the forest and I basically shake a bunch of leaf litter through sieves, and all the small stuff goes through the sieves into a bag, collection bag below. And then after, I can do this in a very systematic way. I can make it transect and I can have a 1 meter squared area of leaf litter that I work on. And then I shake that leaf litter through the grid, and then I throw away the big stuff, but all the little stuff that's sifted through, the ants, the beetles, little bits of dirt, I collect in a bag. And then I go down my transect and I have a whole bunch of bags. And then I can come back to a camp that is just a little protected from rain. That's just a tarp over a makeshift camp. And in each one of those bags is like a little mesh pillowcase. And so I would sort of pour my dirt and stuff into that pillowcase that hangs inside that little structure, hang it up, and then tell people not to bump it. And what happens is over the next few days, the ants and other arthropods who've been so disturbed, they're going to come out and start walking around, and eventually they will fall down and they'll fall into that little bag that has a little bit of ethanol at the bottom. And after 48 or 72 hours, I'll take those bags off, I'll close them up, I'll pack them all into a box. I'll hope that all things go well with the permits and export permits. And then I'll make my way back to the lab, and I will spend the next year and a half sorting through all of these things. And, the rest of my lifetime describing all of these species, something like that. But it's a really interesting approach, and it's one that doesn't require any electricity, and it doesn't require any kind of insecticidal fog. And it's an interesting technique because it can be taken anywhere. Thank you for asking that question. Collection techniques are definitely one of an area I find really interesting.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I'm in the room right now. Here, I'll come over. But I know you said while you were doing your research, you found, I think you said 60 new species. I was just wondering, like, no. It is, but I think they're after us. I'm sorry, someone's in the room. You're good, you're good. But sorry about that. Someone walked in.
problem.
You're good. But I was wondering what the process was of, like, when you find a new species, like, how do you kind of like claim that title and also like go about naming?
This is such a great question.
Yeah.
So there are two answers to that. I'll start with the one that's like the practical part. So there is this international body called the International Commission on Zoological Nomenclature. And it's a legal body, and it literally has rules, like a legal document called the International Code of Zoological Nomenclature. You can look it up. It makes really great bedtime reading. It's just legally like, how do you describe, what do you describe? What happens if you describe one thing and it's given two names? How do you resolve all these conflicts? And that really plays out the rules governing naming. Now, how do you actually do it? Well, first you have to figure out, what do you have? And so the process, as I was saying before, the process of going out and figuring out what do I have in my hand means that you've studied what else has been published from this area, what else is known from similar regions, because what you don't want to do is you don't want to say, I have this new species, but it turns out that, I was in Papua New Guinea, but in Indonesia, somebody has already described this thing. Mm-hmm. So knowledge and context of the fauna is kind of the first requisite. And then the next one is, how do you know that it looks different from this other one? They're probably closely related, but how do you know about those species boundaries, especially if you're not going to do a whole bunch of molecular work like I was talking about doing for those problematic ones? Mm-hmm. Well, that also involves figuring out, do they have some different ecology? Are they found in different places? Do they have different behaviors? And so there's just a certain amount of, okay, I think I know this group pretty well. I've only seen this one live on trees, and this one always lives, out in the open, or something like that. Or one's variable in terms of how it looks, and this one never varies. I think it's a different enough difference that I'll give it a name. There's also a social and cultural and really ethical component to how do you name a species, which is what gives me the right to go to Papua New Guinea, find something on the ground and be like, hey, look, I found a new species. I'm going to name it after my cat, which, let me tell you, happens all the time. I don't know about the cat part, but, for people who go out, especially in remote areas, and they just want to get names, they're like, I had a spider guy who I was working with, and he was like, I'm going to name a spider after you. And I was like, wow, gosh, that's so exciting. And he's like, don't get too excited. I have 80 species, and I've literally exhausted all of my friends, all of my family, all their pets. I'm just going to start numbering them pretty soon. And even though he was saying it kind of tongue in cheek, this is actually a problem in the sense that there's an impediment. It takes a long time to describe species. If you just want to get it done in kind of a factory style, many people are not thinking about, okay, what's the value in the name? Who am I going to think about? Maybe I'll just put that name out there and honor somebody that I know. But increasingly, the idea of naming things with place-based references or with respect for the place, the people who live there, this is really entering into the conversation. So these days, when I describe species, one of my policies that I prefer to adhere to is I try to describe the species in a way that relates to the species or the habitat that it comes from. Mm-hmm. A lot of colleagues that I have who work locally, or who maybe not work locally, but for example, if I was describing many of those new species from New Guinea, I would be reaching out to my anthropologist colleagues who work in New Guinea, who know those field assistants, and I would probably try to find a name. Like if I was describing that as a yellow spider ant, I might ask for the word yellow in the native language in particular, so that it would have some sort of reference to place. So the society, the Entomological Society of America, is really an interesting society because they've decided to take a very forward thinking approach to this. They've created kind of a code of conduct when it comes to common names, even though they don't regulate the International Commission on Zoological Nomenclature. They've decided to develop some procedures for what's appropriate for common names. So rather than naming after people, trying to give appropriate names that are helpful to people in either identifying something or associating them with that place. And there's, if you're interested in this, there's something called the Common Names Project. And recently what had been called the gypsy moth for many, many years, the name has now been retracted, and through a commission of about 60 people, including stakeholders, people who are economically tied to this or have published a lot on it, they decided on a new name. It's called the spongy moth, and it relates to the egg masses that it lays. They decided that it was totally inappropriate to use that name, that old name.
Yeah. That's understandable, but thank you so much for your answer.
Thanks for asking.
Yeah, of course.
I have a question about just like how you got into this field and like, yeah, what made you go into it, and then how it as someone
So
can
sorry, I
turn-
can't hear you very well. I just
Yeah.
heard something about how did I get into this field?
Yeah, and then like how someone can determine if like this is the kind of research they want to do versus like more experimental based research.
Yeah, thank you for asking. I think, so this is a question that I can answer a couple of different ways, and I could give you the short version, which is like, well, this was interesting and I did this thing, and I could tell the linear story, but the truth is that nobody has a linear path. When I was at the end of high school, I was introduced to the idea that you could basically be a natural historian, that I didn't think that existed. Biology was, as far as I was concerned, my high school football coach taught biology. And so I was really not particularly interested. It was a very different branch of biology than I understood. But I met some people who were biologists in the sense of people who studied, I met a person who studied ethnobotany, and that seemed fascinating to me. And I met some other people who studied particular groups of organisms. And so I realized that, okay, biology is a little bit different depending on what you're focused on. So I knew I was interested in plants and insects. And once I started learning about tropical biology, I was totally sold, but I didn't really know what I wanted to do. So I went into college being like, okay, I'll be an entomologist. Like I'll study this stuff. And there was one entomology class and I took it. It was great. And that was it. And after that, it was kind of like, okay, now I have to find some opportunities to learn more. So I ended up getting jobs working with people. I had jobs working on spiders. I looked for any opportunity that would come up. The reason that I ended up working with Terry Irwin is because I was very specifically looking for field opportunities where I could learn more about insects. So I kind of pursued this for a while, and then at some point thought I should really get like a real job, do something practical. I don't know if you guys have that feeling sometimes. My family thinks that doctors and lawyers are very respectable. I'm not sure that entomologist was high on their list. And so I've thought a lot about, okay, well, I could probably combine entomology with medicine, medical entomology. That's something people care about. And I tried that out for a little while, and it was definitely not for me because it was a bunch of people wanting to kill insects. And so it took a lot of soul searching and actually a number of years and talking with people who I really respected and who knew me. When I said, I think I want to go and do medical entomology, they were like, lame, you're not going to like that. And I was like, I'm going to try this out. It's like, oh, you're right. It was just mosquitoes. I wasn't super into that. And when I talked to people about being interested in biodiversity, the concerns people had were things like, systematics is kind of a dead field. This is right before the molecular revolution, when people were still doing just like counting hairs and things. And they said, it's going to be tough to find jobs. And I think these are real practical considerations. You need to be able to make a living and get a job if you want to do well in your chosen field. So I was lucky in the sense that I had time. I worked a number of different professions before I went to grad school. I have some strange skills that are completely tangential to my life as an academic because of that time that I really spent thinking about what was worthwhile. But I really did come back to the idea that biodiversity was important. And I always really liked the idea of taxonomy because it seemed to me like you need to be able to do those fundamental building blocks of identifying species and knowing how to name them. If you want to build up to understanding biodiversity on a big scale, you have to start with each individual species. So when I went back to grad school, it took some time, but I finally felt like I'd landed in the right place. And then from there, once I started actually developing some skills, even if they were skills that were only rarely in demand, I figured that if I could be one of the best ant identifiers and ant taxonomists out there, then, you know, there's usually a job for the best of the best, right? So I just was gunning for the top. And I have to say, there in the United States, there are probably 3 female ant taxonomists. And actually, one of them went to Germany. Never mind, there are 2 of us. I hope there are more in the works, but I think our community is changing now. There were just a handful of people, but I do know that I always had a plan B. And I always tried to keep in perspective that if I knew what I wanted to do and I kept pursuing it, I would be able to always say, okay, this is enough. Like, it's not worth doing this anymore. I have this plan B, which is that, you know, I'm a smart person. I can write, I can, you know, do some other things that maybe wouldn't be my passion, but I guess I could always do this on the side a little bit. And it was very helpful to have friends and family who were like, yeah, this is something that you should do. You should pursue this. Wilson has always said, everybody's born an entomologist. And some of them just forget it along the way. And I pretty firmly believe that everybody likes looking at stuff crawling around, moving around. I always did.
Thanks for telling your story. This is really
Thank you for
interesting.
asking.
But yeah, sorry. We'll send out Dr. Lucky's email if you have any other questions, but we have to wrap up now.
I just realized that I see the chat here and I didn't pay any attention to it throughout. I don't know if there were any questions on there.
There weren't any questions. Yeah. They were just little comments.
Cool. Oh, this is from before. Okay, good. I just hate it when you ask a question in the chat and it goes ignored. Well, if anybody has questions, please contact me. If anybody is super interested in ants and wants to see what it's like working in the ant lab, if anybody has that curiosity, please do reach out. I have a bunch of folks in the lab who started working with me as undergrads, and some of them are continuing on with ant research, or some of them are going to med school. So for those of you who have some curiosity, feel free to come by. It is non-binding.
Thank you so much. I'm sure we have
for inviting
at least
me.
a few people interested. I guess. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Okay, well, goodbye. Have a great evening, everyone.